Here is our brain picture again, sagittal section of the brain. And on this page, we're going to look a little more closely at the four lobes of the cerebrum. Remember that you have a right and a left cerebral hemisphere, and each of those performs some of the same functions, but also there's what we call lateralization, which means that each side is more dominant in particular activities like logical thinking or artistic and creativity, etc. We'll talk more about that as we go through this. Okay, so first, the frontal lobe. We're going to highlight that in pink. So the frontal lobe finishes maturing by somewhere around 25 years of age. And interestingly, this is where our seat of judgment is. In other words, should we get into a car if we've been drinking, or get into a car with a friend that we know has been drinking? Some of the mistakes that teenagers unfortunately make, and it's no surprise that teenagers make more judgment errors like this, because this part of their brain is not yet matured. So other kinds of problem solving, especially when you think about creative or logical, so both sides of those things. There's logical aspects to problem solving and there's creative aspects. Simplistically speaking, we can say that the left side of the brain is more involved with the logical parts of problem solving and the right side more with creative. And the two sides of the brain are linked with this structure here called the corpus callosum. And that should help someone use both sides of their brain when they are problem solving. Understanding of consequences. For example, if I do this, this could happen. We can all tell that that sort of understanding is not yet present in, say, a 2-year-old, right? Also, there's parts of this lobe that are involved in emotions, memory, and learning. And as I mentioned on a previous page, in my opinion, these two things are very important to link when you're studying. Now, there's a special part of the frontal lobe that is devoted to motor output, and we call that the motor cortex. And within the motor cortex, there's an even more specific area known as the precentral gyrus that is responsible for initiating voluntary motor output. This is a very specific ridge on the brain that you can see when you're studying on a model. So over here we'll put that as I think I'll write motor cortex. And then one aspect of that is the precentral gyrus. And then we couldn't move on from this area without also mentioning a really important speech center that scientists have found called Brokas area. And the way they find that a part of the frontal lobe is involved in this is basically by seeing what happens if someone has had a stroke or for some reason this part of the brain has been damaged. We'll call this BA. Or Broca's area. Broca was an anatomist, a scientist that lived about 100 years ago. And he found that when a patient lost the ability to speak, and then after they died, he was able to look at their brains, he would find, if he found dead cells in this region, it often corresponded to the patient not being able to speak while they were still alive. Of course, as you probably know, strokes happen more often toward the end of someone's life, and so he might have been able to follow a patient near the end of their life and then study their brain after they had died. So Broca's area is important for speech output. And not only did he find that this area is important for being able to talk, but he also found that it's usually lateralized. In other words, you don't have a Broca's area on both sides of your brain. It's usually lateralized to the left hemisphere. So if someone wants to talk, a lot of things have to come together. They have to have fully functioning Broca's area, and then they have to combine that with voluntary motor output, and then those action potentials have to go down to the brain stem and then out a cranial nerve to the tongue, and then down the spinal cord to muscles that control the larynx so that speaking can occur. So when you think about all the stuff that has to happen, it makes sense that little children don't all learn to speak when they're 1 or 2. Sometimes they are 3 or 4 before they start to get really good at it. Okay, so now we'll look at the parietal lobe. Oops, sorry. And we'll do this in blue. So you can get your blue highlighter and come with me on a journey around the parietal lobe. Okay, so the parietal lobe that we've colored in blue has a lot of ability to process sensation. And so instead of having a motor cortex like the frontal lobe, we say it has a somatosensory cortex. And I'm going to even show you where that's mostly localized with this purple pen right here. So that's the somatosensory. Somato means body. Sensory means processing inputs. And part of that is the postcentral gyrus. So it's behind the precentral gyrus. So you have the precentral gyrus in the frontal lobe, and then what's called the central sulcus that divides the two. We can write that on here. The central sulcus. And then the postcentral gyrus is in purple here. And it processes your sense of touch. What that means is that in this little area of your brain, you can sense touch everywhere on your body and is even localized to different areas. So think about the parts of your body that have the greatest sense of touch. Your fingers, your lips, and the genitalia. All of those take up inordinately large parts of the postcentral gyrus. And then as a comparison, something like your back doesn't have a lot of area devoted to processing. Another important role of the parietal lobe is similar. It's tied in with your sense of touch. It's called tactile object. Object recognition. This is something that you can see developing in children. Think, for example, of if you were to reach into your junk drawer in the middle of the night, you would probably know everything that you're touching without even seeing it, right? So that's why we say tactile means to touch something and to recognize it. But little children are still developing this skill, and so sometimes at interactive places for kids, like Padilla Bay has an interpretive center, and they have a place where little children will stick their hand into a box and they can't see what they're touching. It might be a pine cone, it might be a clamshell, and they have to guess what it is. And this is a challenge for them because their brain is building up a storehouse of information about what it is they're touching. Another special job of the parietal lobe is sense of taste. Is processed here, and sometimes that's called the gustatory center, like gusta, to take pleasure in something because it tastes good. And then we wouldn't be complete with, our fairly simplistic overview of brain functions without mentioning another important language area that's located in the parietal lobe. And this one is named after another scientist called BER Nikki. It's spelled with a W, but because he was German, it's pronounced Nikki. BER Nikki's area this part of the parietal lobe is really devoted to vocabulary. And when I say vocabulary, I actually mean, first of all, knowing the words, right? So understanding the words that are spoken and choosing the word to say. As we all know, it's one thing to learn the definition of a word, but then to use it in a sentence, right? Which is what kids have to practice at school. Once again, we notice that this is lateralized to the left hemisphere. If you are left-handed, it may be lateralized to your right hemisphere. But interestingly, even most lefties have their language centers focused in the left side of their brain. Okay, next let's look at the occipital lobe. I'm using orange. The occipital lobe has one really well-documented job, and that is being our visual cortex. So now, have you seen we've got 3 cortexes so far? The motor cortex, frontal lobe, that helps you move. And then the somatosensory cortex, that helps you process feeling and touch and sense, all the senses like that. And then the occipital lobe is totally devoted, or I should say almost entirely devoted, to processing your sense of vision. That right there should give you a huge clue as how important vision is to humans, because all of this is devoted to processing. Now, if your eyeballs are up here, it means that the information has to go from the eyeball back to the diencephalon and then back to the occipital lobe for processing. This is also why if you fall and hit the back of your head, you might see stars. What's really happening is random action potentials are fired because you got hit so hard, and then it seems as if you're seeing a picture. Okay, and then last but not least, we'll come to the temporal lobe, which in a sagittal section like this, you can only see a little bit of it from the side, but that's okay. So we'll be studying it in class together too. Temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is devoted to processing your sense of hearing and your sense of smell. And also very important in memory. Remember that the frontal lobe is also very important in memory. So there's a lot of cross-wiring too between olfaction and memory. And to give you a great example of this, I remember as a little girl, I had to go to this babysitter that I didn't like. And her name was Mrs. Wise, and I'm sure she was a perfectly fine woman, but I did not want to be at the babysitter's. And she had this strange smell in her house. I think it was a little bit of like a cross between musty and dusty. And she had these little beads that would hang from this door that she would make me take a nap in. So to this day, when I smell that smell or I hear the jingle of those beads, a similar kind of beads, it immediately takes me back to the memory of being at that babysitter's. And it's not a good feeling I have because I didn't want to be there. Okay, so that's the temporal lobe. And then go ahead and highlight in orange the occipital lobe. Highlight in blue the parietal lobe. And highlight in pink the frontal lobe. Ooh, we can't see that very well when I highlight it, huh?